Picture this, folks. Seriously, close your eyes for a sec. You're there, standing in the sun-drenched, gleaming marble corridors of a palace in ancient Macedonia. The air is thick with incense, expensive perfumes, and a weird, underlying scent of desperation. Yeah, desperation. Because you're about to witness a wedding, all right. But this ain't no fairy tale, no Disney romance, not even close. This is one of the most chilling, most screwed-up wedding ceremonies in ancient history, period. The fine linen robes they've forced onto her skin, they feel like a rough, scratchy cage. She's watching, observing herself, as some servant adjusts the golden diadem, that freaking crown that marks her as queen. Queen, my ass. Her hands, oh man, they're shaking. Not from excitement, not from nervous anticipation, nope. Her hands are shaking from a rage so deep, so bitter, it's like she's trying to swallow scorching wine, and it's burning her from the inside out. Through those towering, pristine marble columns, you can just make out the Macedonian nobles down in the courtyard. Their voices, so loud, so full of celebration. They're cheering like it's some kind of triumph, some big win. If only they knew. If only they knew the damn truth. See how we just dropped them right into the scene, right into Arsinoe's skin. That's the vibe we're going for. Next up, we're gonna pull back the curtain a bit and show 'em the messed up world she was born into. Get ready, 'cause it only gets crazier from here. You still with me? Like, subscribe, and tell me if you felt that chill down your spine. Context, where princesses are pawns. You know, in our world, a princess might dream of a fairy tale, a prince charming, a happily ever after. But in the brutal, shifting sands of the Hellenistic age, a royal daughter wasn't a dream, she was a tool. A living, breathing piece of political currency to be traded, sold, and manipulated. This wasn't just some vague historical period. This was a cutthroat era, right after Alexander the Great kicked the bucket and his generals, the Diadochi, tore his empire into pieces. Imagine these massive, sprawling kingdoms, Macedonia, Egypt, the Seleucid Empire, all fighting, clawing, constantly trying to outmaneuver each other. And at the heart of it all, power. Absolute, undeniable power. Arsinoe. She was born into the gleaming, brand new city of Alexandria. A city of impossible possibilities, drawing scholars and traders from across the whole Mediterranean. But beneath all that shine, that philosophical debate, it was a city built on a knife's edge, constantly proving its legitimacy. Her father, Ptolemy I, was one of Alexander's most trusted generals. He built a kingdom, all right. But he also built a prison for his own daughter. See, for women like Arsinoe, your beauty wasn't even your own. It belonged to the dynasty. So here's the burning question. In a society where women were literally diplomacy made flesh, where your very existence was a political statement, did someone like her, someone who was always out of sync with the rhythm of this power machine, ever truly have a place? The answer would be brutal, written not in ink, but in her own agonizing experience. That question, that burning uncertainty, hung over her entire life. It was the backdrop to the moment her existence truly shattered, when she was shoved headfirst into the abyss of political marriage. Get ready, because the first real blow was about to strike. You know how some moments in life just hit you, like a hammer blow that reshapes everything you thought you knew. For Arsinoe, that moment came when she was just 15. Can you even imagine? 15 years old, practically a child, and her father, the powerful Ptolemy I, made a decision that would not only define her life, but carve out a new, terrifying path for the entire dynasty. The year was 3001 BCE. The echoes of Alexander the Great's conquests still rumbled across the land, but his empire, it was a shattered vase, its pieces being fought over by his ruthless generals. The air was thick with shifting alliances, betrayals, and the constant, gnawing fear of war. In this brutal chess game, Lysimachus, the grizzled king of Thrace, needed allies, and Ptolemy, Arsinoe's own father, needed to secure his borders. The solution, simple, cold, and utterly devastating for a young girl: marriage. Lysimachus was 55 years old, a grizzled veteran who had fought beside Alexander himself from the Danube to the Indus. His body bore the scars of 100 battles, including a famous encounter with a lion. A man built for war, not for tender feelings. To young Arsinoe, who was still just figuring out the world, he must have seemed like a figure straight out of some terrifying legend, magnificent perhaps, but certainly terrifying. This wasn't about love, not even a whisper of it. This was about power. This was about armies joining, territories secured. This was a treaty written not on parchment, but in flesh and blood. The wedding was held in the ancient city of Sardis, once the capital of the Persian Empire. The great hall was packed, filled with nobles from across the Greek world, their voices echoing off gold-leafed walls. And there stood Arsinoe, draped in Egyptian linen dyed with royal Tyrian purple, her dark hair crowned with a diadem that caught the light of 1,000 oil lamps. She was beautiful, yes, in that way teenage girls are, all potential, all promise. But in her eyes, a raw, carefully hidden fear flickering amidst a surprising glint of intelligence. As Lysimachus placed the ring on her finger, his hands, these very hands that had once held Alexander's stirrup, were calculating. You could practically see the gears turning in his mind. He spoke the ancient words of the Greek marriage ceremony, but his eyes were already weighing armies, territories, the next conquest. When she shared the ceremonial wine, it must have tasted like ash, a bitter preview of a future that would be both intoxicatingly powerful and utterly, utterly devastating. This wasn't just a wedding. It was the stripping away of identity. From that moment on, she was no longer just a princess of Egypt. She was queen of Thrace, a pawn in a deadly, treacherous game. She was a possession, a bargaining chip in the hands of men. I had no choice. She must have whispered to herself, "I don't know who I am anymore, but they certainly know what I will be." The wedding feast lasted 3 days, apparently. Poets sang, comparing her to Helen of Troy, Penelope. Musicians played, dancers performed. But beneath all that false celebration, the harsh truth of her new reality gnawed at her. She was currency, and she had just learned the first, brutal lesson of her life in this new, dangerous court. Survival here wouldn't be about beauty or bloodline. It would require something far more sinister: cunning, patience, and a ruthless willingness to do whatever the gods, or rather, whatever men, demanded. That first bitter taste of power and sacrifice was just the beginning, a horrifying primer for the treacherous game she was now forced to play. Little did she know, the true stripping away of herself, the real agonizing transformation, was yet to come. She was about to be pushed, relentlessly into a world where every step was a gamble and every choice stained with blood. Get ready for the next brutal chapter, because her very essence was about to be peeled away, layer by agonizing layer. Hey, if this story is already pulling you in, imagine what's coming next. Don't miss a single agonizing detail. Hit that like button right now, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, what would you do if your life was decided for you at 15? I'm genuinely curious to hear your thoughts. You know, there's a twisted kind of magic in survival, right? Especially when you're cornered. Arsinoe, this young queen, barely out of childhood, wasn't just going to wither away. No, she began to shed her old self, layer by agonizing layer, to become something else entirely, something colder, sharper. Life in Lysimachus's court was like walking through a minefield. His kingdom was constantly under threat. To the north, Thracian tribes gnawed at the borders, hungry for Greek gold. To the east, the sprawling Seleucid Empire, led by the cunning Seleucus I, was always probing for weakness. Everyone watched everyone, a constant dance of suspicion and plotting. In this environment, Arsinoe learned the first great lesson of her life. Survival required more than beauty or charm. It required the ability to read the currents of power, to know when to advance, when to retreat, when to speak, and crucially, when to remain absolutely silent. She watched her husband's courtiers like a hawk, studying their prey. She had to decode every subtle sign of alliance, every whisper of betrayal. It was an education, all right. A brutal, unforgiving masterclass in royal intrigue. And within a year, something shifted. She got pregnant. Her first son, Ptolemy, was born in 299 BCE. Suddenly, she wasn't just a wife, she was a mother. Not just a queen, but the founder of a potential dynasty. 2 more sons followed quickly. Lysimachus in 297 BCE and Philip in 294 BCE. Every single birth, every tiny heartbeat strengthened her position. Each child was a hostage to fortune, yes, but also a new weapon in the deadly game of royal succession. But here's the rub. Lysimachus already had an heir. His eldest son, Agathocles, from his first marriage. And as Arsinoe's own sons grew from infants to toddlers to young boys, the question of succession started to dominate the court. Who would inherit the kingdom? The older son, born of a commoner, or the younger, royal sons, born of a princess of Egypt? The whispers began to spread slowly. Servants gossiped in hushed tones about the Egyptian queen's ambition. Nobles started to take sides, some backing Agathocles, others seeing opportunity in the younger princes. Arsinoe found herself at the very center of a web of intrigue, growing more tangled with each passing year. She began to grasp the true nature of her position. She wasn't just a queen, she was a foreign queen. Her loyalty was always under a magnifying glass. Her children, they were a direct threat to the established order. The very court that had celebrated her arrival now watched her with a chilling suspicion. Every word she spoke was analyzed for hidden meaning. Every gesture was scrutinized as a sign of plotting. The pressure was enormous, overwhelming. Imagine being a woman in your 20s, miles from home, with 3 small children, surrounded by smiling enemies whispering poison behind your back. The weight of expectation pressed down on her like a physical force. Her father had invested Egypt's future in this marriage. Failure wasn't just personal disgrace. It meant weakening the entire Ptolemaic dynasty. So Arsinoe learned to play the game. She started cultivating allies among the court ladies, using her Egyptian gold to buy loyalty. She patronized philosophers and poets, building a circle of intellectuals who sang praises of her wisdom and beauty. She even participated in religious ceremonies, showing respect for the local gods while silently holding onto her own Egyptian practices. Slowly, meticulously, she began to build a power base, one independent of her husband. She wasn't just surviving, she was strategizing. The crucial moment, the real gut punch, came in 283 BCE. Arsinoe's eldest son, Ptolemy, hit 16. By Greek custom, he was now old enough to be considered for the succession. The question could no longer be avoided. Who would inherit Lysimachus's kingdom? The old king was now 73, his hair white as snow. He had ruled for 39 years, longer than Alexander had lived. He had two impossible choices: support Agathocles and risk alienating his powerful Egyptian allies, or back Arsinoe's sons and face a brutal civil war. What happened next? Historians have argued for centuries. Some claim Arsinoe seduced her husband into eliminating his rival. Others say she simply laid out the brutal political realities he couldn't ignore. The truth, as always with these ancient stories, was probably far more complex. But one thing is terrifyingly certain. In 283 BCE, Agathocles was arrested on charges of treason. The evidence was thin: a few intercepted letters, some suspicious meetings, bribed witnesses. But in the world of Hellenistic politics, the appearance of guilt was often all it took. Within days, Agathocles was dead, executed on his own father's orders. The court recoiled from the shock. Agathocles had been popular, a proven military commander. His execution sent a chilling, unmistakable message. Arsinoe's sons were now the heirs, and anyone who opposed them did so at their peril. But this was no clean victory. It came at a terrible, agonizing cost. Agathocles' death ripped the kingdom apart, creating factions that would never truly reconcile. Many of the old nobles, men who had served Lysimachus for decades, now saw Arsinoe as nothing less than a foreign sorceress, a wicked force who had corrupted their king. The whispers grew louder, more venomous. They called her a second Medea, a woman who would destroy everything she touched in pursuit of power. The external enemies of the kingdom, sensing weakness, began to stir. Seleucus I, the last of Alexander's original bodyguards, moved against Lysimachus's eastern territories. The Thracian tribes pressed harder. Pirates raided the coasts. The kingdom was eating itself alive, distracted by internal divisions. Then, in 281 BCE, the crisis exploded. Seleucus invaded Anatolia with a massive army, claiming to avenge Agathocles' death. Lysimachus, despite his age, took the field one last time. At the Battle of Corupedium, two old men, both in their 70s, faced each other in what would be the final, brutal confrontation of their generation. The battle was a disaster for Lysimachus. His army crumbled. The old king himself fell, his body pierced by a dozen spears. With his death, the kingdom of Thrace collapsed like a house built on sand. Arsinoe, now a widow at 35, found herself in the most dangerous position of her life. She had 3 young sons to protect, but no army. The kingdom her husband built was dissolving around her, torn apart by ambitious generals and vengeful nobles. Seleucus was advancing on the capital. There was nowhere to run. But Arsinoe had not survived 2 decades of court intrigue by being passive. Even as the news of her husband's death reached her, she was already planning her next move. She gathered her most loyal supporters, secured what treasure she could carry, and prepared to escape. The woman who had been carried to Sardis in a bridal litter was now fleeing for her life. The irony was bitter, sharp like a poisoned blade. She had played the game as well as any man, sacrificed her stepson, endured decades of suspicion and hatred. And now, in her moment of crisis, she found herself with no choice but to run. Running was just the first desperate act. But the nightmare wasn't over. Oh no. The woman who thought she had lost everything was about to face a betrayal so profound, so utterly horrifying. It would make everything that came before seem like child's play. Her darkest hour was still waiting. You know that feeling when you think you've hit rock bottom, when you've lost everything and there's nowhere else to fall. For Arsinoe, even that desperate flight, that bitter irony of escaping for her life, was just a prelude. A dark, terrifying setup for the true abyss. Her darkest hour, the moment she was truly shattered, was still waiting. The journey to safety was harrowing. Picture a royal caravan moving through the dead of night, torches flickering in the darkness, the muffled sound of horses' hooves on the sand. Arsinoe rode with her 3 sons, Ptolemy, now 17, Lysimachus, 15, and Philip, 12. They weren't princes anymore. They were refugees, their royal robes replaced by rough travelers' clothes. Behind them, the kingdom burned. Seleucus had seized the capital, his soldiers systematically hunting down anyone connected to the old regime. Arsinoe's supporters were being executed or enslaved. Cities that once cheered her arrival now opened their gates to her enemies. But in a chilling twist, Seleucus himself wouldn't live to enjoy his victory. Even as Arsinoe fled westward, another drama, far more sinister, was unfolding. Ptolemy Ceraunus, remember him, her half-brother, the son of her father's first marriage, who had been stewing in exile at Seleucus's court. Seleucus, the old king, had actually promised to help Ceraunus regain his birthright, to install him as ruler of Macedonia. But Ceraunus was impatient and utterly ruthless. At the very moment of triumph, as Seleucus prepared to cross into Europe, Ceraunus struck. He murdered his host, his benefactor, claiming the army and the throne of Macedonia for himself. The last of Alexander's original companions, dead, killed by a man young enough to be his grandson. This horrifying news reached Arsinoe as she sheltered in a harbour town on the Aegean coast. Her half-brother, the man who had nursed his grievances in foreign courts for decades, was now king of Macedonia, and he was offering her marriage. Can you even begin to process that? The proposal came from a messenger, speaking in honeyed words about reconciliation, family unity. Ceraunus promised to acknowledge her sons as his heirs, to give them the kingdom Lysimachus had lost. He spoke of love, of destiny, of the Ptolemaic bloodline ruling in Macedonia just as it ruled in Egypt. Arsinoe listened with a face like stone. She had heard such promises before. from Lysimachus, from countless courtiers. She knew the hollow weight of royal promises, how quickly they could be forgotten when convenience demanded it. But she also knew one terrible, crushing truth. She had no choice. Her sons needed protection, and she needed a throne from which to provide it. The decision to accept Serenus's proposal, it was the most difficult of her life. This wasn't some naive girl making a mistake. This was a woman of 40, hardened by tragedy, scarred by betrayal, who had seen the full horror of what men could do when power was at stake. She knew marrying her half-brother was a desperate gamble. She was walking into a trap with her eyes wide open. But what else could she do? To refuse meant perpetual exile, watching her sons grow up as pensioners, dependent on charity. To accept meant risking everything on the faint hope that blood might mean something, that family ties might prove stronger than political calculation. As she prepared to leave for Macedonia, Arsinoe made one final, agonizing decision. She sent her eldest son, Ptolemy, away to the court of a distant ally. If disaster struck, and she knew it was coming, at least one of her children might survive to carry on the bloodline. It was a mother's wisdom, born of bitter experience and a desperate, heartbreaking love. The wedding took place in Pella, the ancient capital of Macedonia. Serenus spared no expense, staging a magnificent display to demonstrate his legitimacy. But underneath all the gold and purple, the music and dancing, lay the cold, hard reality of political necessity. Arsinoe stood beside her half-brother as priests performed ancient rituals. They were children of the same father, products of Ptolemy's multiple marriages. In Egyptian tradition, such unions were not only acceptable, but sacred, a reflection of the divine marriages that maintained cosmic order. But to the Greeks, there was something deeply unsettling, even an abomination, about this match. Something that spoke of desperation rather than destiny. The wedding feast lasted 3 days, but the honeymoon, it was measured in hours. On the very night of their marriage, Serenus revealed his true, horrifying intentions. He had married Arsinoe not for love, not even for political alliance, but to eliminate the very threat her sons represented. With her safely in his power, he could deal with her children at his leisure. The betrayal was swift and brutal. Serenus's soldiers surrounded the palace quarters where Arsinoe's 2 younger sons were staying. The boys, Lysimachus, 15, and Philip, 12, were dragged from their beds and murdered in front of their mother's eyes. Their blood stained the marble floors of the palace where Alexander had once played as a child. Arsinoe's screams. They echoed through the halls of Pella, a sound that would haunt the palace for generations. Her grief was a luxury she simply could not afford. Even as her sons, bodies were being dragged away, a new, terrifying resolve hardened in her eyes. She was planning her escape. The woman who had survived 2 decades of court intrigue was not about to let this betrayal be her end. She had learned from her father's example. Ptolemy had escaped impossible situations by being faster and more ruthless than his enemies. Now, even as guards watched her every move and servants reported her every word, Arsinoe began to plot her own survival. Her screams still echoed, but the raw agony was already hardening into something cold, something dangerous. She had hit rock bottom, yes, but even from that deepest pit of despair, a spark of defiance flickered. She would not only escape this horror, she would twist her very victimization into a weapon. Her fight for freedom and for a terrifying kind of redemption had just begun. Her screams still echoed through those cold palace halls, a haunting symphony of a mother's agony. But the raw despair, the crushing grief for her murdered children, it wasn't going to be her end. Oh no. That raw agony was already hardening into something cold, something dangerous. She had hit rock bottom, yes, but even from that deepest pit of despair, a flicker of defiance ignited. She would not only escape this horror, she would twist her very victimization into a weapon. The escape itself was worthy of a novel. You know, the kind of story that makes your heart pound just reading it. Using a network of loyal servants and the underground channels of slaves and freedmen that existed in every palace, Arsinoe managed to slip away from Pella in the dead of night. She was disguised as a servant, her royal robes swapped for rough wool, her jeweled diadem replaced by a simple headscarf. And in a brilliant, audacious move, she left behind a decay, a slave woman who bore a passing resemblance to the queen. That decay would buy Arsinoe precious, life-saving hours before the deception was discovered. The journey to safety was a living nightmare, a terrifying gauntlet of narrow escapes and hidden dangers. Serenus's soldiers were everywhere, hunting for the woman who had dared to humiliate their king by escaping his trap. Arsinoe moved through the shadows, helped by a network of supporters who risked their own lives to shelter her. Some were driven by loyalty, others by gold, but all understood they were playing a part in a drama that would be remembered for centuries. Her destination was the sacred island of Samothrace, a place where ancient mystery religions offered sanctuary to those who sought it. The island's temples were protected by customs older than the Greek cities, older than the Macedonian kingdom itself. Even Cernus, the ruthless king, wouldn't dare violate that sacred precinct of the great gods. As her ship approached the rocky shores of Samothrace, Arsinoe must have felt the full, crushing weight of her losses. She had been married 3 times, borne 3 sons, ruled as queen of 2 kingdoms. Now, she was a refugee, dependent on the charity of priests and the protection of ancient laws. 2 of her sons were dead, brutally murdered by her own half-brother. The 3rd was in exile, his future utterly uncertain. But Arsinoe was not a woman to be defeated by disaster. Even as she grieved, she was already planning her next move. She had 1 card left to play, one last, desperate chance to rebuild her life and secure her legacy. Her youngest brother, Ptolemy II, now ruled Egypt as pharaoh. If she could just reach Alexandria, if she could convince him to take her in, she might yet find a way to survive. But the journey from Samothrace to Alexandria was fraught with peril. Cernus's ships patrolled the northern Aegean, and pirates infested the southern waters. Yet Arsinoe had learned to be resourceful, to use every single advantage available to her. She traveled in disguise, sometimes as a merchant's wife, sometimes as a pilgrim seeking religious instruction. Her legendary beauty, once her greatest asset, was now hidden beneath rough clothes and careful makeup. When she finally reached the harbor of Alexandria, the city of her birth, she must have felt a complex, swirling mixture of emotions. This was home. But it was also the place where her exile had begun 4 decades earlier. The palace where she had played as a child was now ruled by a brother she barely knew, a man who had been an infant when she was first married to Lysimachus. Ptolemy II Philadelphus was 36 years old, a scholar and administrator who had inherited his father's prosperous kingdom. But he was a cautious man, unwilling to take the risks that had made his father great. The reunion between brother and sister was awkward, charged with decades of separation and mutual suspicion. Arsinoe was no longer the young princess who had left Alexandria in a bridal litter. She was a woman hardened by tragedy, scarred by betrayal, desperately fighting for a second chance. Ptolemy II saw in her both an opportunity and a threat, a sister who might be a valuable ally or a rival who might challenge his authority. The negotiations were delicate. Arsinoe needed sanctuary, yes, but she also demanded a role worthy of her experience and ambition. She couldn't simply retire to a comfortable exile, couldn't accept the life of a dependent relative. She had been a queen, a mother, a player in the great game of power. She would not be content to simply fade into obscurity. If I cannot live as myself, she might have thought, then at least I will die as myself. Or better yet, I will remake myself. That defiance, that iron will forged in the fires of hell, was about to lead her to the most audacious, most shocking move of her entire life. A decision that would redefine power, family, and what it truly meant to be a queen. This was her final gamble, the ultimate chess move to reclaim her destiny, even if it meant shattering every societal norm. You know, some people are broken by their suffering. They fade away, whispers in the wind. But then there are those rare, terrifying few who take their chains, their agony, and forge them into a crown. Arsinoe II was one of them. From the ashes of her shattered life, she was about to do the unthinkable, become a goddess, and redefine what it meant to be a queen. The solution, when it came, was as shocking as it was brilliant. Ptolemy II was already married to another Arsinoe, Arsinoe I, a woman who had given him children, but lacked the political sharpness to be a true partner in ruling. So, what if he divorced his wife and married his sister? Not just any sister, but this Arsinoe, the one who understood the brutal, complex game of Hellenistic politics better than almost anyone alive. Now, the idea of sibling marriage wasn't new to Egypt. For 3,000 years, pharaohs had occasionally married their sisters, following the example of the gods themselves. Isis and Osiris, the divine couple who ruled the underworld, were brother and sister. Their union wasn't seen as scandalous. It was sacred, a reflection of the cosmic order that kept the universe in balance. But the Ptolemies, they were Greek, and to the Greeks, sibling marriage was an abomination. It violated the natural order, offended the gods, threatened society itself. No Ptolemaic ruler had ever married a full sibling before, though they'd occasionally married half-siblings or cousins. The decision to break this taboo was not made lightly. Ptolemy II knew he was crossing a line, setting a precedent that would define his dynasty for centuries. But he also saw the insane advantages. By marrying Arsinoe, he would be following the example of the pharaohs, claiming the divine authority that came with sacred marriage. He'd be showing the world that the Ptolemies weren't just Greek kings ruling Egypt, but true pharaohs, inheritors of the most ancient traditions. The announcement of their engagement sent shockwaves through the entire Greek world. Poets and philosophers debated the morality of sibling marriage. Politicians calculated the implications for their own kingdoms. Some saw it as a sign of Egyptian decadence, proof that the Ptolemies had been corrupted by their foreign subjects. But others, they recognized it for what it truly was, a masterstroke of propaganda, a way to claim legitimacy that no other Hellenistic dynasty could even dream of matching. The wedding itself. Oh, it was a magnificent affair, designed to emphasize the divine nature of the union. The ceremony took place in the great temple of Ptah in Memphis, the ancient capital where pharaohs had been crowned for millennia. The rituals were Egyptian, not Greek, emphasizing the sacred nature of the marriage and the divine status of the couple. Arsinoe, now 41 years old, stood beside her 26-year-old brother wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the symbol of pharaonic authority. Her brother wore the traditional regalia of a pharaoh. The hymns sung that day were ancient beyond reckoning, texts that had been old when the pyramids were built. They spoke of divine marriage, of the union between earth and sky, order and chaos. They proclaimed that the royal couple were no longer merely human, but had become gods, worthy of worship and veneration. The Greek inhabitants of Alexandria were scandalized, of course, but they were also awed. They had never seen anything like this. The Ptolemies had always balanced their Greek and Egyptian identities, but now they were declaring themselves fully Egyptian, fully pharaonic. This marriage wasn't just ceremonial. It transformed both partners. Ptolemy II became Ptolemy Philadelphus, the brother lover, a title that was both description and boast. And Arsinoe, she became Arsinoe Philadelphus, the sister wife, sharing in the divine authority of the pharaoh. Together, they were the theory Philadelphoi, the sibling-loving gods, ruling Egypt as Isis and Osiris ruled the underworld. But the transformation was more than just a fancy title. Arsinoe brought to this marriage decades of brutal experience in the deadly game of Hellenistic politics. She had survived the courts of Lysimachus and Ceraunus, had seen kingdoms rise and fall, had learned the art of survival in a world where weakness meant death. Now, for the first time in her life, she was in a position to use that knowledge without fear. This new queen threw herself into the work of government with an energy that simply amazed her subjects. She accompanied Ptolemy on his tour, settling disputes, managing the complex relationships between Egypt's diverse ethnic groups. She became a patron of arts and sciences, keeping Alexandria the center of ancient learning. But her greatest contribution, it was in foreign policy. The Hellenistic world was more dangerous than ever. Arsinoe understood the importance of divine imagery in projecting power. Under her influence, the royal couple started appearing on coins and monuments as gods, their images linked with Egyptian deities. They were shown receiving offerings, blessing the land, maintaining cosmic order through their sacred union. And it worked. Egypt's subjects, both Greek and Egyptian, started seeing their rulers not just as foreign conquerors, but as legitimate pharaohs, inheritors of a tradition stretching back to the dawn of civilization. The divine marriage had given the Ptolemies something no other Hellenistic dynasty possessed: a claim to authority that was both political and religious, both Greek and Egyptian. The personal cost, though, still enormous. She had sacrificed everything, her first marriage, her children, her youth, to reach this position. She had endured decades of exile and betrayal, watched her sons murdered before her eyes, fled for her life across the Mediterranean. Now, in the twilight of her life, she had achieved the ultimate prize, a share in divine authority, a place among the gods themselves. This marriage produced no children, but it didn't need to. Ptolemy II already had heirs. What mattered wasn't biological reproduction, but political and religious transformation. The Ptolemies had become something new, something that transcended the ordinary boundaries of human authority. As Arsinoe stood in the palace of Alexandria, wearing the crown of the pharaohs, she must have reflected on the insane journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been a pawn in her father's diplomatic games, a trophy wife to an aging king, a victim of her half-brother's murderous ambition. But she had also been a player in her own right, a woman who had used every tool available to her: beauty, intelligence, ruthlessness, and sheer, bloody determination to survive and ultimately triumph. The tradition she established would outlast her by centuries. Future Ptolemaic rulers would follow her example, marrying their siblings to maintain the divine authority of the dynasty. The practice would reach its culmination in the most famous of all Ptolemaic queens, Cleopatra VII, who married two of her brothers in succession and used the prestige of her divine ancestry to challenge Rome itself. But that's a story for another day. For now, as we witness Arsinoe in her moment of triumph, we must marvel at the price she paid for power and the ruthless determination that carried her through decades of suffering to this final vindication. She had been forced into incest, not once, but twice, had been used as a tool of dynastic policy from childhood to middle age. But in the end, she transformed that victimization into victory, that suffering into strength. The woman who had once cowered in a Macedonian palace as her children were murdered now stood as a goddess in the land of the pharaohs, her authority unchallenged, her legacy secure. She had paid the ultimate price for power, but she had also achieved the ultimate reward: immortality. Not just in the memory of historians, but in the religious traditions of the people she ruled. As the sun set over the Nile, casting long shadows across the palace gardens, Arsinoe must have felt a deep, complex satisfaction. She had survived the unsurvivable, triumphed over impossible odds, transformed herself from victim to goddess. The girl who had been sold into marriage at 15 had become the woman who redefined what it meant to be a Ptolemaic queen. But the cost, oh, the terrible, heartbreaking cost, would never truly be forgotten. Every future Ptolemaic marriage would carry the echo of her sacrifice. Every divine ceremony would remember the price she paid. She had saved the dynasty, yes, but she had lost herself in the process. She had become a symbol rather than a person, a goddess rather than a woman. Man, what a journey, right? Arsinoe II's story is a chilling reminder of how power can crush, but also how the human spirit, even when twisted and broken, can fight back in the most unexpected ways. What do you think of Arsinoe's choices? Was she a monster, a survivor, or both? Let me know in the comments below. And if you were absolutely gripped by this tale, please hit that like button Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more deep dives into the dark, incredible corners of history. Your support means the world.